the changes that have been proposed by the government are essentially a pathway for those that already have received or who might receive in the future that golden visa to allow them to buy property. Whether or not we see a massive change in the property market, you're going to be probably better qualified than I to comment on that.
Yep.
But essentially, what it's going to allow people to do, $5 million property and above, if you've got that golden visa, as we call it, essentially that opens that door for you to purchase property in that window and above.
So a lot of people out there assume now a foreign buyer, that can be basically anyone outside of Australia and Singapore, which we can now obviously transact with, can turn up into New Zealand, buy property for $5 million. Is that the case?
No, that's not the case, Richie. So there's essentially two different categories within the Active Investor Plus visa. You've got a growth and you've got a balance. Now both of those have different investment thresholds.
Yep.
5 million under the growth in certain direct investments, and then 10 million under the balance under more, shall we say, conservative investments. Now your property purchase doesn't count towards either of those investment thresholds. So whatever you're investing in order to get your visa, this property purchase is purely ancillary. It's on the side. Persons with a residence class visa, generally speaking, can buy property.
Yes.
Right? But they've got to be here for 183 days. Now that's the main change. So the whole purpose behind this pathway is that you no longer have to meet that 183-day threshold.
Right.
If you've got the golden visa.
Right.
If you've got some other form of residence class visa,
Yep.
you still need to be what we call ordinarily resident.
Yep.
Meet that 183 days.
Now they could go through the pathway, buy a house, but not have to be in New Zealand.
Correct. One thing to be mindful of at this pathway, which is just one property.
One property?
One property.
Interesting.
It's just the one.
Right, so they can't come in and buy three.
No.
Just restricted to one.
Correct.
So, in regards to types of property that they can purchase, there's obviously a few different sort of angles that we would look at. You've obviously got your already built home, potential holiday home, Lock and Legal Queenstown. There's off-plan. You may have an off-plan subdivision of a nice high-end home, and then just land by itself. So obviously 3 areas that people would look at. Are they able to purchase in all three of those, or is it specifically in one area that they can?
They can't buy what's called otherwise sensitive land, right? So they can't go out there and buy the 5 hectare farm, right? The rural land over 5 hectares, that's called otherwise sensitive. They can't buy that. They couldn't buy a property that was more than 4,000 square metres adjoining the lake or adjoining certain conservation land. So land that's otherwise sensitive is not being open, still not open to those who are not ordinarily resident. Okay? They can only buy what we would typically call your standard residential or lifestyle property that is not otherwise sensitive. So once you're through that gate, you've essentially got, as you said, the different types of property. You might have a BLN section. So the answer is yes. They can buy a BLN section, and it doesn't have to be more than $5 million. Okay, but essentially the cumulative investment in property, in that property, has to exceed $5 million. So you could have, for example, a $3 million section and a $3 million build, and that would be a committed property purchase. So we haven't quite seen the mechanics of how that's going to work, and we can assume what that might look like based on other visa and other OIO pathways that are in place at the moment.
When are these changes looking to take effect?
It's not a definitive date, but all indications are that we'll see them by the end of the year. So in theory, those golden visa holders who have already been approved are pretty well placed to look at property for the end of the year. And as you all know, there's various ways in which you can do that. That might be an agreement that's conditional on them getting OIO approval via this pathway. That's a possibility. But that's going to really depend on the vendors, whether or not they are willing to accept that.
What's your thoughts around what this could potentially mean for Queenstown?
I think for the most part of the market, it's not going to have any sort of massive impact, particularly on price or competition for property. I think the government's being deliberate in picking a threshold of $5 million, which is considerably higher than most properties are worth. There will be those properties that sit at or about 5 million that I think will be interesting.
Yeah.
You know, that could potentially drag them in to that threshold. You know, who knows? That's, you know, time's going to tell. It really depends on demand once again.
Yeah.
And I think the matter that's going to probably temper that happening too much is that, as we spoke about before, they can still buy land. You know, they can still buy land and build for, you know, land for 2, build for just over 3, and you're in, right? So these people aren't silly. They're not going to overpay.
No.
You wouldn't expect. I might see a little bit of that property in the forest creeping up.
So it's interesting. The overseas buyer is actually a $10 million buyer, really.
At a minimum.
At a minimum, if you look at it from the outside. So it's invest $5 million, to spend $5 million on the house. Yeah, interesting. For me, I would think it may be a slow change.
There's still a little bit water to go under the bridge in terms of how it's all going to play out and the exact, as we said before, mechanics of it all. But I think the first step for anyone who's wanting to pursue this as a potential pathway to property, if property is their main driver, is you've got to get the visa. Our firm is working very closely with sort of specialist barristers and immigration advisors who are specialised solely in immigration. We find that that's probably the best way to cut through the noise, and the ones who are at the coalface doing it very regularly. And then we help them the clients with the property side of things.
From application time and through to the ability to then be able to come and see someone like myself to purchase. How long is that?
So I mean, it does depend on how organised your buyer is.
Right.
Because the actual time frame once you get your application lodged is not that long.
Right.
It's around about 30 working days, roughly, on average. But you've got to have all of the information to actually submit that application. There's a stepped process at the moment, so it's get your approval or apply, get your approval in principle, make your investments within 6 months after receiving that.
That's quite quick, isn't it?
Yeah, so you've got to be really mobile. The thing's just going to be figuring out the relevant conditional period. You know, how long is this going to take?
That's right.
It's not just going to be 10
working days.
and it's not going to be the 30 working days that we spoke about before, unless this person's ready. You know, unless they're really ready. It's going to be longer than that. And so it's just a matter of making sure you're organised.
So quite a few hoops to jump through before they got the ability to purchase.
But these might be some sticky properties, right? There might be properties that have been difficult to sell. They're at a price point where there's not a great deal of buyers. New Zealanders and Australians and the like, and so it might be worth it for a vendor to wait.